you, Bob. Thank you, Roland. Welcome, everybody. What is it to become white in this country? To self-identify with the social construction of racial whiteness. There are probably as many answers to this as there are people who self-identify as white. But a number of good studies have shown some familiar patterns. I'm just going to share some right now quickly. Often these studies list that the first stage of racial identity for whites is non-awareness, the state where the phrase, "I don't see race," is very common. They don't see their own, they don't see others. The next stage is when whites will sometimes see other races, but they don't see their own race. They see themselves as the norm or the standard by which others are compared. Then they may develop an awareness of the racial constructions of all people's races, racial identity, but within an assumption that we're living in a society that's relatively free of racism, involving sort of a denial of white supremacy. At the next level, often their views are contradicted by people of color. And when that occurs, when racial justice is pointed out, whites often experience confusion or guilt or anger or depression. And in response, many will either retreat into white culture or they'll argue against the claims that racism exists. So it's like a fight or flight reaction to those negative experiences. And in the next stage, whites take fuller responsibility for fighting racism in collaboration with people of color. They work to reject white supremacy and to listen and augment the voices of people of color. I hope I'm in that engaged, collaborative stage, but I know that my work is never done. I continue to try to understand and process the construction of whiteness and its relationship to my efforts to be involved in racial justice work. But today I'm going to largely put aside academic frameworks and try to just tell my own story and try to make some sense of it. It's in part the beginning of a platform that I'll be giving in Baltimore the Sunday of our assembly, which, if you don't already know, is June 8th through 11th in Baltimore. I urge you to go. The topic of the entire assembly theme is communities confronting systemic racism, something that the ethical culture leaders have been committed to for a couple of years, and the Saturday workshops are going to focus on that. So I urge you to consider, even if you can't come for the whole time, to come down for Saturday. So, before I begin the story, I do want to admit that memory is unreliable. Sometimes we forget things. Sometimes we repress things that are painful, emotionally or physically. In order to protect ourselves, we sometimes forget what we've been unable to process. Other times we magnify our suffering, dwelling on accidents or injustices that befell us in our lives. And this can deepen the wound and replay the trauma. Therapy can help us let go of unhelpful patterns and bring to consciousness what has been under the surface so that we can process these experiences and continue on in life freer and less burdened. So therapy can heal. As we grow older, I think we develop more conscious control of our story. We become selective. We tell our story to amuse or to inspire, forgetting a little here, adding a little there, until the story becomes the memory. In a way, we construct our past. Sharing our story becomes a creative process. And depending on our identity or our sense of self-worth or our disposition, we construct memories that reinforce the narrative we want to share with the world. Terry Gross, one of the favorites here at NPR, the host of Fresh Air, has interviewed thousands of people and said, when I'm interviewing somebody, I'm getting a combination of fact and truth, and self-mythology and self-delusion, and selective memory and faulty memory. So in sharing with you about my story of becoming white, I'm going to try to be objective, but I don't want to pretend that my story is objective. It's serving my needs. It's serving my needs to be connected with with the human race of all shades. It's connecting to my desire to not be ashamed. It's connected to my desire to justify being your ethical culture leader. And most of what I contribute today and in the work that I do, I owe to friends and colleagues of color who have patiently shared their wisdom and experiences with me. I don't pretend to be an expert or free of internalized racism. I'm still learning about what race means in this country, and I'm still learning to understand my whiteness so that I can be a better anti-racism activist. It's a work in progress. The earliest memories I have was when I was a kid in Worthington Hooker Elementary School in New Haven, Connecticut. I would go to lunch with a particularly well-stocked lunchbox, and my classmates would often notice. And they would say things like, "Your mom gave you 2 cookies? Can I have one?" And eager to make friends, I would say, "Sure," I'd share my lunch. And pretty soon, my sharing expanded. I would be asked casually if I had any money, a dime or a quarter. If I had some loose change, I would share it, because it seemed like, again, an easy way to make friends. It had happened more. I didn't know when I began realizing that most of the kids asking me for money or stuff for my lunch were kids of color. I began to feel an uneasiness with a pattern that was going on. Maybe I was afraid that I would disappoint or anger some of my classmates if I didn't continue to share. And when my mother asked me why I was bringing money to school when there was no place to spend it at school, I felt embarrassed, accused, and ashamed, and I confessed. And she didn't overreact, but she said I had to stop. She said, "These other children, it's too bad that they don't have the resources that I have, but they shouldn't be asking, and I should encourage them." So the lines began to be drawn in my head as a little kid, dividing me from the other. Race and privilege began to get intertwined in this uneasy psychological knot. It was reinforced when riding around town in my mother's car in New Haven, Connecticut in the 60s, which in my mind was basically a city of ethnic neighborhoods. I mean, I had a lot of friends who lived near me who were Anglo-Irish background. My Italian friends lived in Worcester Square area or West Haven. Some of my Jewish friends tend to all live downtown. And most of the blacks lived in a place over the hill near Dixwell Avenue. These were the neighborhoods that we drive around with, and it was the neighborhoods that I really noticed poverty in our city. The only neighborhoods I noticed real poverty. And my mother would make sure I knew that these were places I wasn't supposed to go. In 5th grade, difference and race and fear became more tangled up. During my first year at Hammond Hall, which was my first private school experience, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And the next day, which was a Friday, my teacher, Mrs. Livingston, called us into the classroom for something of a public service announcement. And she said to us, "Be careful when you go home today and over the weekend, because many of the black children are angry and frustrated and might take it out on you." And that sank deeply into me, adding more fear to this mix of race and privilege. And I began to see myself as a target because of my whiteness. Soon my family moved onto the campus of Yale College, and I felt pretty safe, symbolically and physically protected from the rest of the city by these Gothic walls all around me. The courtyards and the plazas were my playgrounds. The black college students that I came to know as role models were friends that my parents knew. 2 of them were Kurt Schmoke and Calvin Hill, who came to my parents asking for help in creating a daycare center across the street from my house, which was for everybody, but primarily they started to serve the maintenance and service workers at Yale, who were primarily people of color, and didn't have affordable daycare options near their work sites. So that bonded them to my parents. Kurt Schmoke, who most of you know was mayor of Baltimore. He was a Rhodes Scholar, and he's now president of the University of Baltimore, visited our family up in our summer place for a couple of summers around his graduation time, and he became an important role model for me in my sense of activism, and he's a mentor to me today. He's got a very soft-spoken personality, and I remember feeling there was such a shocking difference between the turbulence of race relations around me at the time. In 1969, the turbulence both around me and inside me got greater because my parents moved to Berkeley, California for a year, and 1969 was a hell of a year to be in Berkeley. There were peace protests and race protests on and off the campus of the University of California. And in my own middle school complex, which was a massive complex, lots of buildings and hallways, it had just been renamed in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. And the frustration and anger of that assassination was palpable at the school and in my classmates of color. It was a school that was primarily made up of kids of color. And so as my fear increased, I began to be approached more often and a little more assertively by kids of color asking me for money. And they'd say, "Can I have some money?" And I'd lie. I'd say, "I don't have any money." And they'd say, "If I have any money on you, can I keep it?" Yeah, and afraid of being searched and found out to be a liar, I'd usually say, "Yeah, here, can I give them some money?" Because at that school, we did need money to buy food at the cafeteria. Lunch hour was a particularly difficult time for me because there were kids that would walk around and I'd scout out where I could go that was safe, and I ended up hiding out in the chess club. I remember telling you about that before, because that was a safe place for me to hang out. And my retreat from the hallways did very little to help me resist a rising, growing distrust of kids of color. In my high school and my college life, I retreated into an ivory tower, a prep school and Ivy League bubble, helped nurture this belief that the civil rights movement and affirmative action were really changing the world. And that was the narrative that I took hold of, because I needed a narrative to be positive for me. I think perhaps I thought I had escaped the more nefarious aspects of racism when I became good friends with my sophomore year roommate, who was a friend of color. And so I think I began to believe that I had escaped whatever scars I had and escaped the systemic racism all around me. I felt pretty good about it into my teaching career, where I was teaching every year about slavery and Jim Crow and the civil rights movement, believing that I was telling a narrative that was both shocking and true, but reinforcing that liberal faith that we're getting better step by step. It nurtured a great faith and respect for the leaders of the movement. I mean, every year I would show Eyes on the Prize, and I began to feel like I really understood King and Abernathy and John Lewis and Stokely Carmichael, Nathaniel Hammer. And I began to feel a little less comfortable, ironically, when I became the diversity director at this small private school. Now, one of the odd things is one of my friends wondered whether I was being taken advantage of, and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, Hugh Taft-Morales." And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, Hugh Taft-Morales." And he said, "Maybe you're just being picked to be diversity director because of that Hispanic last name," which was ironic because I married into that. That was my wife's maiden name. 15 years into teaching, when I took the position of director of diversity, I suddenly became less comfortable because I became a conduit for the frustration of parents, students, and teachers of color. As they got to know me and trust me more and talk more to me, my faith in my own narrative that things were constantly getting better began to get challenged. And my confidence began to crumble. Now I was not just asked to say the right things, but to change a system that was deeply embedded in the racism that seeps into every nook and cranny of this culture. As more black students and teachers and parents of color told me their stories, I felt like here I was armed with the best intentions, but I was stumbling into the role of a diversity director. In consultation with a number of people at the school, my first big project was to come up with a 4-part panel discussion to try to get some emphasis on this issue, on issues of race in the media and various other things. We had multicultural panels. And then I went to visit the head of the Black Student Fund to sort of get to know her and work with her. This is the organization that was really the main funder of scholarship students who were primarily kids of color in Washington, D.C. Fairly influential organization. And I heard that the director did not suffer fools gladly, but I thought my sincere commitment and my charm would win her over. It was going pretty well for about 30 minutes, and then right before I left, I said, oh, I just want to mention to you that we have this panel series. And I showed her this glossy trifold, and she looked at it for a second, stood up, handed it to me, and said, I don't have time for you, get out. And my face just went totally beet red, and I stood up and I sort of stammered an apology and walked out with the tail between my legs. And for a couple of days, I was working through feelings of embarrassment and anger. How dare she accuse me? I'm the good guy here. I came to see her because I want to make a difference, right? This is some of this internal narrative that went on in my head. I didn't want to be the bad guy. I was there to be the good guy. And here I felt I was being accused of being unthinking or ignorant or racist. And for most whites who think that they are liberal progressives working for racial justice, the worst thing you can be called is a racist or ignorant about race issues. And then after a day or two, when my feelings subsided, it began to dawn on me. Here I was, a young white teacher from a privileged school in an Ivy League college, coming to see the director who is in charge of mentoring most of the students of scholarship of color in the D.C. area, and I hadn't talked to her about my first major multicultural project. And it suddenly began to make sense. Maybe I should have touched base first. Now, I know that she dealt with a lot of white saviors in her time, people who thought they had the answer and protect themselves behind their belief that they are the savior, but end up being pretty blind to the wounds of people of color in this country. And that's when my real education began, already as director of diversity. I began to take courses at the Black Student Fund. I took a National Association of Independent School workshop, weekend workshops on issues of race and diversity issues. I hired a consultant to come in who helped work with the faculty on issues of this. And I read a lot of cutting-edge research on racial identity formation. And like my contemporaries, I had grown up thinking that racism was just not liking people of other races, right? That's a lot of my colleagues grew up with that belief. Unaware that racism can be unconscious and buried in the very system of our culture and our society. I didn't understand even that whites had the privilege of ignoring racism, which is a form of racism called aversive racism. Part of the privilege of being white or of any majority group is to not have to think about what it's like to be in the minority group. Primarily also because I didn't have to protect my children from daily physical, verbal abuse and threats to their life because of racism. So it's easier to forget. It was about that time that I began to reread and read classic works by black luminaries such as Booker T. Washington, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin, Lerone Bennett Jr., and Du Bois. And Du Bois really affected me. He grew up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and he was one of the very few blacks in his area. And without a large black population to pose a real threat to that community, he grew up relatively well accepted. He was a brilliant student, and he was praised for it in his school. And ironically, it wasn't until he went as a college student to Fisk University in Tennessee that he was confronted most blatantly with the historical and contemporary racism of his time. In developing his worldview about race, Du Bois wrote about the problem of the color line in America. And the color line, he talked about, created a veil, quote, a veil between him and full enjoyment of opportunity in America. And as this estrangement grows in him, so did the power of this awareness. He writes, Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in my own house? The shades of the prison house closed around all of us, walls straight and stubborn to the whitest, but relentlessly tall and narrow and unscalable to the sons of night, who must plod darkly on in resignation, or beat unavailing palms against the stone, or steadily, half hopelessly, watch the streak of blue above. It was on the other side of that veil that he vaguely saw white America enjoying the full privileges of America. More subtly, the color line, Du Bois writes, is not just between whites and black, but within the soul of black folks, cutting consciousness in half and denying a sense of wholeness. He writes, it's a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. He continues, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. This inner division, both caused by racism and reinforcing racism, attacks the psychic unity of people of color, making full and free participation in society very difficult. A second related way the color line benefited whites in the 1900s, around the time he wrote The Souls of Black Folk, is that many whites saw the problem of the color line as only being inside of blacks. Not as a result, not something they had to deal with. Right? If it's only a problem within the souls of African Americans, it's for the blacks to solve. Historically, the problem was defined as the black people. What shall be done with the Negroes? That's a quote Du Bois used. Very similar to the way the Indian problem was not described as a clash of cultures, but the problem was the actual existence of Native Americans at all. That was the Indian problem. That's how it was discussed in U.S. policy circles. In the same way, blacks were identified as the problem. And even the allies of African Americans in this country placed the problem in the hearts of those they hoped to serve. Du Bois describes sympathetic whites coming up to him and saying, in so many words, this is a term that Du Bois uses, how does it feel to be a problem? Right? How does it feel to be a problem? Du Bois didn't answer that. He didn't think it was a legitimate question because it was not a question that was seeking the truth of the experience, but it was a question framed by whites placing the problem in the soul of the other person. And the wisdom that I got from Du Bois helped me support students of color and parents of color at this private school who felt both a part of my school but different from it. I tried to confront administrators or teachers who saw the problem solely as the problem of the black kid or the black parent. I hope to heal some of those inner divisions that have left untransformed inhibit wholeness. Now, interestingly enough, I began to feel a sense of two-ness in me, maybe an echo of that, as a white person. And I have to admit, the whole concept of whiteness is both relatively new and it's somewhat controversial. Many of you who read Du Bois' work didn't agree with it, or certainly some here probably have issues with it. Most people know The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois' famous 1907 book, but very few know about the follow-up essay he wrote in 1920 called The Souls of White Folk. And in it, he was analyzing, basically, World War I, and how very few people in America understood World War I as he saw it, as a war basically over how to divide up the spoils of the lands of people of color. And if you look at the map after World War I and all the problems that followed from that, it's obvious how true that was. Du Bois said, "The discovery of personal whiteness among the world's peoples is a very modern thing. A 19th and 20th century matter, indeed, the ancient world would have laughed at such a distinction." Now, halfway through my work as Director of Diversity, I started something called a white identity group. A white identity group. And it was a little controversial. I mean, some denied that there was no such thing as whiteness. Many people, for example, identify with their ethnic background. You know, I'm Mexican, I'm Irish, I'm Polish, but they won't necessarily say that they're white. But there were other reasons for this resistance, because usually, if a group of whites and whites alone were cordoned off to discuss the issue of race, it was either a neo-Nazi meeting or a Klan rally. Right? But I thought it was an important thing for whites to talk about. And the Faculty of Color was supporting my effort, because a few years earlier, before that, I started a Faculty of Color group. At first, some of my white colleagues found it a little uncomfortable. They said, "Why do the black teachers have to talk without whites present in the room?" Many of you know the answers that might come up for this. I said, first of all, these conversations were already happening in segregated spaces. Whether it was in a conversation in the parking lot, or a phone call in the evening, or just a knowing glance during a faculty meeting across the way, African Americans were talking about this issue without including whites. To share the frustration at navigating a primarily white and privileged institution that's often blind to their struggles. And the Faculty of Color appreciated the Faculty of Color space that was given, quote unquote, by the school to them. Because it allowed a space where the institution is saying, "We want you to share your story if and when you feel comfortable in sharing it. And here's how you can come together to talk about that process." It was giving the process hope. I thought some white colleagues need the same space during that time. They didn't feel safe discussing race. For example, they were afraid to ask questions that may show internalized racism or show them as insensitive or ignorant. They were afraid to speak freely. And rather than work through their own resistance to these conversations, many of them would just grin and bear the multicultural workshop that we're being dragged to. So no real work was getting done. But the white-on-white discussions had the ultimate goal of sharing with the Faculty of Color the hopes, fears, and questions of the whites who wanted to try to overcome racism in the school and in themselves. It was in those conversations that I began to understand this sense of two-ness that I was experiencing, a split identity within whites. At this point, I have to be very clear about this. I don't mean to appropriate Du Bois's term of two-ness, or lapse into a common refrain of, "We're all the same, so why can't we just get along?" Which can happen. I know that the division within blacks in this country is exponentially greater than the division I was feeling in me. But nevertheless, the two-ness I was feeling was painful enough to keep me divided and less effective as an anti-racism activist. Now, I admit many of the whites I worked with had their own very unique take on these conversations and their relationships to white identity, and many of you do as well. I'm just describing my experience and my path. And generationally, there are huge differences when you talk to millennials and younger kids. The whole concept of race is going through an incredible change, but the inner division that I felt came to me in response to the question that Du Bois was asked. How does it feel to be your problem? The questions that I got, especially from colleagues of color who had the trust in me to confront me honestly, would say, how does it feel to belong, Hugh? How does it feel to be comfortable with who you are? How does it feel to be privileged without even knowing it? In other words, how does it feel to be white? And I was confused about that question because I hadn't been asked it. Growing up, I didn't know how to answer it, I didn't even know how to bring to light the privilege because I'd been able to avoid those questions as part of my privilege. So growing up with this sense of two-ness, varied, but with it a keen desire to be part of the solution, and yet here I was part of the problem still. Here I was director of diversity, an ally of people of color, but I also represented a system that was still full of racist assumptions and patterns and behaviors. On the one hand, I channeled the messages from parents, students, and teachers of color. On the other hand, I could remain comfortably outside the veil that many of the colleagues of color felt trapped in. On the one hand, I was an anti-racism activist. On the other hand, I had racist assumptions and habits within me that I still had not discovered or processed. Some of this two-ness definitely manifests itself in white guilt. I felt caught in this little inner dialogue that reduced me to an unintentional but guilty participant in unearned privileges. And it became part of the double-edged sword of white privilege. Elizabeth Denevy, who worked in our school of diversity issues, wrote, "The inequities in such privilege are obviously painful to people of color, but they can also be painful to white people, many of whom feel that it strips them of their individuality and turns them into unappealing stereotypes," which was exactly what I felt was happening to me. From 100 years ago, Du Bois said, basically, get over it. He wrote, "I insist that the question of the future is how best to keep these millions from brooding over the wrongs of the past. We should instead work for a larger, juster, and fuller future." I wanted to stop brooding, so I kept working in myself and in my school and in the world. Now recently, new writings have regenerated and deepened my commitment to racial justice. Some of the ones that I've talked about before: Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, Michael Eric Dyson's Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America. And reading these again, I begin to process my experience and my two-ness, and I understand it better and it burdens me less. In the New York Times, Dyson, who's really one of the most important voices today, I urge you to read him, said, "It is clear that you, white America, will never understand us." And I resist that. And I say, no, I do, sort of. That's what I want to say, right? But how can I possibly understand? Dyson says, "We are a nation of nearly 40 million black souls inside a nation of 320 million people. We don't all think the same, feel the same, love, learn, live, or even die the same. So how could I possibly understand, right?" Dyson says, "At birth, you are given a pair of binoculars to see black life from a distance, never with the texture of intimacy. Those binoculars are privilege. They are status, regardless of your class." And I want to claim, no, I'm an exception. I'll put the binoculars away. But I've come to understand that part of the growth in this, in dealing with the two-ness that's inside of me, and it's inside anybody whose eyes are open and is living in this country, is that our ideals and the reality clash. It creates a two-ness that none of us can escape. The two-ness in me says I'm fighting for racial justice, but I'm also an inheritor of racial privilege. But that two-ness no longer paralyzes me. Rejecting privilege is lifelong work. I'm still at it. Not as good as I'd like to be. But the two-ness that's pressed down upon Du Bois was not of his own doing. And the two-ness is in me despite my best intentions. So I'm going to try to understand it and process it and not dwell on it, because there's too much work to do to dwell on it. But I do have to work with it. I have to find my most effective way to be an anti-racism activist for me to feel like I've earned the privilege to be your ethical society leader. What also helped me was reading the writings of other white anti-racism activists. Again, I've mentioned them here before. I apologize, but if you haven't read Peggy McIntosh's Invisible Privilege, White Privilege, read it. I have a list of she has like 120 privileges that most whites have that her friends of color do not have, and I have about 40 of them for you. You can read at your leisure. I read Tim Wise's White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son, which helped me channel my anger and frustration and awkwardness by encouraging me to be more self-critical, be more honest with myself. And he also taught me to speak less and listen more, which is ironic given that I am at the microphone. But knowing the history and telling the truth means you have to listen to voices in the past, voices in the present. I remember there was a fairly typical concern among white teachers at my school about why all the black kids tend to sit by themselves during lunch. Beverly Tatum had already written the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And we hadn't read it. So before saying that they are guilty of self-segregation, maybe read the book. Wendell Berry, another white writer, wrote a book called The Hidden Wound. He says this: if white people have suffered less obviously from racism than black people, they have nevertheless suffered greatly. If the white man has inflicted the wound of racism upon black men, the cost has been that he would receive the mirror image of that wound onto himself. As a master, or as a member of a dominant race, he has felt little compulsion to acknowledge or speak of it. The more painful it has grown, the more deeply he has hidden it within himself. But the wound is there, and it is a profound disorder, as great a damage in his mind as it is in his society. I hope that in not denying the wounds that I got as a kid, I'll be able to look past them into the deeper, more systemic wounds of people of color in this country. For those who actively identify as white and want to be more effective as an anti-racism activist, I urge you to join me in that work. Look at the wounds you may have within you. Be part of an evolving effort to get past them and to process white identity so that we can all be better at stopping the wounding, incarcerating, and killing of people of color in this country. Thank you very much.